Alrighty, so today what we're going to be doing is we're just looking at some answers for this offline worksheet that I posted up earlier this week with the research scenarios. So we're just going to go through and kind of understand how we come to this, come to the answers, or what is the IV, what is the DV, etc. Okay, so the first scenario basically says that a researcher will randomly allocate 50 year 6 students to one of two groups. Okay, now if we underline 50 year 6 students, remember we said that whenever there's a number attached to the population, that no longer is the population, that is the sample. Okay, so 50 year 6 students is the sample because it's got the number 50 attached to it. Okay, if that number 50 wasn't there though, if it just said year 6 students, that would then turn into the population, because now we don't know, it's undefined as to how many year 6s are actually taking part in the experiment. Okay, so whenever you've got a population, it's always very generally stated. There's no specific number attached to it. But whenever we've got a sample, there is a number that's attached to it. Okay, so that's the main kind of difference between the two. And it's important to know the difference between the two, because whenever we write a hypothesis, for example, we don't refer to the sample, we always refer to the population. So we would never say it was hypothesized that 50 year 6 students. Okay, the hypothesis is always written in a very general way. And remember, the memory tip for does anyone remember what's the memory tip for the research hypothesis that we used to use?
iPod?
Yeah, iPod. And we also add that one last letter at the end, which is C, just to acknowledge our control group. So basically iPod C. So in iPod C, we see there's no S's there. So just remember, you should never include the sample. It's always P for population. Okay, so if there's a number attached to the people taking part in the experiment, just ignore that and just get rid of that and just write year 6 students. It was hypothesized that year 6 students, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's the first really important thing to remember. So before we get to the research hypothesis, let's have a look at the IV and DV. So we'll read the rest of the scenario first. So it says group 1 will receive praise by their teacher for correctly spelling words given for homework. Group 2 will not receive praise. One easy way to figure out what the IV in a scenario is to look at what variable is given to one group but is not given to the other group. In this case, we can see that praise is given to group 1, but praise is not given to group 2. And so that should give you an idea that that is the IV. And then the researcher will then measure. And whenever you see the word measure or determine or calculate, remember we define DV as the variable that's measured for change. So this should give you a clue, or something in the rest of this sentence should give you a clue as to what the DV is. Okay, it's something to do with spelling words and the number of words that are spelled correctly. Okay, so that's really important, that even when we're reading through scenarios, you need to go back to your definitions of what IV and DV are. If we talk about IV, DV as representing a cause-effect relationship, we're basically talking about the idea. Which one did we say was the cause, guys? In the cause-effect relationship, is the IV the cause or is the DV the cause?
The IV is the cause.
Yeah, correct. So IV is the cause and the DV is the effect. Yeah, that's what we're measuring for change. So always link back to those concepts there. So in this case, the simple IV or the non-operationalized IV is going to be the praise, okay, or receiving praise, or whether or not someone receives praise. You can word it in many different ways, okay? The IV is praise. We know the experimental group are exposed to the IV. In this case, the experimental group is group 1. And the control group is not exposed to the IV, which is group 2, because they're not exposed to, or they don't receive the praise. Operationalized IV is basically how the participants are receiving that praise. There's not a lot of numerical information here, like they don't tell us how many times the teacher is going to be praising the child. For example, they don't say as measured by praising the child 3 times in the space of 1 hour. There's no information like that. So we can just literally write praise as measured by whatever frequency the teacher praises them with. Okay, that's not given to us in the scenario, so we just make an assumption there. Okay, so I'll just write that down. Praise as measured by the given frequency with which the teacher praises the student. Again, because these scenarios are quite short, some of them don't have enough information to properly kind of operationalize the variable, but that could be one particular thing that we look at. Okay, the next thing that we're looking at is the DV, and the DV basically talks about the spelling, okay, the spelling of the words there. So the simple DV or the non-operationalized DV might be something like, oh, let me just change this, okay? It might be something like, you know, spelling ability, okay? We just really write it in a very vague way, not very specific there. We leave the more specific wording for the operationalization part. So spelling ability might be a very simple DV there. Okay, how we operationalize that DV is given here in the last line. We'll measure the number of words correctly spelled by each group. So the same thing would come down here. All right, spelling ability again. I'll just type it, that'll be faster. So right, spelling ability again. And then you write as measured by the number of words correctly spelled by each group, or correctly spelled by each group. Okay, so that's basically how we operationalize the variable. Again, not too much information in terms of numbers, but that is how they've measured that variable in this study. So that's what we will write. The aim of the study is basically the general objective of the study. Okay, we usually start the aim of the study with words like to investigate, to determine, to calculate, to analyze. So words like action verbs there. So to investigate the effect of IV on DV. Okay, that's basically what the aim of the study is, the kind of template you would use. So if we're going to use that template, we would say to investigate the effect or the impact, impact. In fact, we won't use the word effect, we'll use the word influence of praise on a student's spelling ability. Okay, that's the aim. The aim is really generally stated, and it's usually only worth 1 mark. Okay, so that's the basic idea of how you write the aim. The research hypothesis is probably the more meatier part of any research methods question. It's where we have to actually give a proper prediction, or we have to write about what the actual prediction the researcher makes with reference to his research scenario. So we always start with the 4, we call them the magic words. They're not magic, they don't have magical properties, but I don't know why I call them that. So it was hypothesized that, okay? Then we remember we put in the population. So can anyone write in the chat box, what is the population for this particular scenario? What is the population? Remembering that the population is basically our sample without the number. Yeah, year 6 students, excellent. So it is hypothesis. I'll probably put it in caps so it stands out. Year 6 students. And then we have to write what happens to these year 6 students. What are they exposed to? What kind of IV are they exposed to? So year 6 students who received praise, that's our simple IV. And we can just operationalize that as measured by how frequently they were praised. Again, there's no clear number given in the scenario, so we just got to make it up. Then we talk about what's going to happen to them, okay, who received praise. And remember, we always need to quantify. We need to measure the actual impact. So is it going to be increased? Is their spelling ability going to decrease? According to the researcher hypothesizes that the spelling is likely to increase, okay, as a result of praise. And that makes sense, right? You would imagine that if you were constantly telling a student, good work, that, you know, that positive reinforcement would help the student to improve as compared to putting that student down and making them feel bad. So are likely to have increased spelling ability. That's a simple DV as measured by the number, or you could say as measured by an increased number of words spelled correctly. And then the last thing we need to include is our control group. That's why the memory tip is iPod C. So compared to year 6 students. And remember, the control group is literally the group of the study that don't receive the IV. So who do not receive praise. That's it. That's our research hypothesis. So that would get 3 or 4 marks there, okay, because we've included everything we need to include. Okay, I know research methods is a little bit dry, but is there anything in this scenario, anything we've done, any way that we've approached answering any of these parts that doesn't make sense, or anything that confuses you about it.
Miss, you know for the operationalized DV,
Yeah.
can you like make it up? Like for example, can you be like the mark comparison from the start and the end after they were praised? Can you loud?
If they haven't given you enough information about the operationalizing of the variable, then you can talk about it. Then you can make it up, kind of. Yeah, you can do that. But because in this scenario, they've given us enough information about the DV, they've said it's measured by the number of words correctly spelled by each group, we can use that. However, for the IV, you notice that we kind of made it up. They haven't talked about frequency of praise anywhere in the scenario, but we kind of made that up, if that makes sense.
Okay.
However, usually at a year 12, like next year at that level, they usually give you enough information so that you won't have to make it up. All the information will be given, and the scenarios are way longer than just 3 lines or 2.5 lines. So yeah, you can expect to have all the information there for you. So you don't have to use your imagination too much. No worries. All righty, cool. We'll move on to the next one. We'll try to do at least maybe 2 more, just so that you guys get the hang of it. And some of you still haven't submitted this, so make sure you submit this so I can have a look at it as well. All right, the next one is called scenario 2. So it says a sleep researcher is concerned about the safety consequences when public transport drivers are sleep deprived. He plans to conduct an experiment to test the effects of amount of sleep on tram drivers' reaction time. One group of tram drivers will be allowed to go to sleep at a normal time and then will be awakened at 7 a.m. A second group will be kept awake until 3 a.m., allowed to go to sleep, and then awakened at 7 a.m. Both groups will undertake a computer-assisted reaction time test every 2 hours during the 8-hour period after awakening. Mean test scores will be calculated for each group so that a comparison can be made. So we can see here that you've got you've got different bits in this scenario. It's a little bit more extensive than the others. It's always good, rather than trying to identify what the IV and DV are in the first line, after reading the first line of a scenario, read the whole scenario and then go back and read it again to identify. Okay, sometimes you get a better clue as to what the IV and DV are after you've read the whole scenario as compared to just reading the first line. So here we can see that it says that he plans to conduct an experiment to test the effects of amount of sleep on tram drivers' reaction time. Okay, so that should technically be our simple IV and our simple DV. Okay, because reaction time is something we measure, and remember, DV is a variable that's measured for change. Amount of sleep is something we can manipulate. Okay, in this study, for example, it says that one group was allowed to sleep at a normal time and they weren't woken up during their sleep. They were just woken up at 7 a.m. when it was time to get up. The other group was kind of experiencing a bit of sleep deprivation. So they were kept awake until 3 a.m., allowed to go to sleep, and only awakened at 7 a.m. So they've only technically experienced probably 4 hours of sleep there. Okay, so our second group is the control group. They're the group that are not kind of getting enough sleep there. Okay, and how are we measuring reaction time? Well, it says they're going to undertake a computer-assisted reaction time test every 2 hours during the 8-hour period after awakening. So that information will be really important for us to operationalize the DV. So if we look at operationalizing the variables now, we know that the non-operationalized IV is going to be amount of sleep. We take that directly from the scenario. And the operationalized IV is going to be whether participants slept at a normal time before awakening at 7 p.m. or whether participants were kept awake until 3 a.m. and then awakened at 7 a.m. Okay, you can probably write that in a shorter way, but my brain is currently not working very well to do that. Okay, so that's basically what that would look like. Okay, so we're just operationalizing. This is how it was measured, because remember, if I want to sleep deprive one of the groups in my study, I could make them stay awake until 5 a.m. and wake them up at 7 a.m. I don't have to give them 4 hours of sleep. I could only give them 2 hours of sleep or 1 hour of sleep. Okay, it depends on the way that we decide to measure that variable there. Okay, so that's the IV there. The DV, the non-operationalized DV, is just the reaction time of the tram drivers. So just reaction time. And how we're operationalizing that DV is that we are measuring the mean test scores. So the mean test scores on a computer assisted reaction time test. So mean test scores on a computer assisted reaction time test taken every 2 hours. In the 8-hour period after awakening. Okay, so I'm trying not to paraphrase this too much because I want you guys to see that a lot of this information is directly taken from the scenario itself. It's not really like we're reinventing the wheel here. We're just literally taking that from the scenario and applying it to our answer. So you can see here, the non-operationalized IV is very general, very vague. The operationalized IV becomes very specific. That's where we get all the detail. That's where we start to hash out and understand, okay, this is how this variable is measured. Because I can measure reaction time in many different ways, okay? Reaction time, I could like throw something at someone and see how long it takes them to react. That's another way you can measure reaction time, okay? So there are many ways we can measure any variable there. If we look at the aim of the study is already given to us. In fact, we'll try to highlight that before we look at the answer. Okay, the aim of the study is literally in between this second sentence there. He plans to conduct an experiment to test the effects of amount of sleep on tram drivers' reaction time. So all we do is we just write that in here. We just write I always like to start with to investigate, but you can start with any action verb there. So to investigate the effect of the amount of sleep on the reaction time shown by tram drivers. Okay, that's basically what you don't even need to mention tram drivers there. Okay, but that's basically what the aim would look like. Again, aims are never worth too many marks. They're usually only worth 1 or 2 marks. So you don't have to put a lot of detail in there. Okay, now that we know what our population is, in fact, I forgot to ask you guys, what is the population here? The broader group of people who are taking part in the study and to whom the results may be generalized if possible. Are we dealing with high school students? Who are we dealing with? Who are the group of people? If you know, just write it in the chat box. Excellent, tram drivers, yeah, tram drivers, okay. And look, according to what this researcher is saying, is he's saying that if they can test on tram drivers, they may actually go back and try to generalize it to all public transport drivers. So if there are not too many limitations, not too many flaws in this guy's study that he does, he might actually go back and generalize these results to bus drivers, okay, to people who drive other forms of public transport like trams. Oh, sorry, these are trams, like trains, for example. Okay, so they might go back and generalize that to other public transport drivers too. Okay, so now that we're looking at this, now that we're looking at the research hypothesis, what we're going to be writing for this is, start with the 4 words. It was hypothesized that. Okay, and then we put in our population, so tram drivers. And then we explain what happened to the tram drivers, what conditions did they go through. Okay, so tram drivers who let's see, one group of tram drivers.
Miss, wouldn't it be public transport drivers because it's more like broad?
It's more broad, but in a sense, because the aim focuses on tram drivers, the aim is usually connected to the specific study that we're looking at. So if we said public transport drivers, it might be a little too, because look, if we look at the 2 groups of the study, it says one group of tram drivers will be allowed to go and a second group will be kept awake. So it's kind of assuming that tram drivers are the people that are making up the 2 groups, the experimental group and the control group. Okay. It doesn't say, for example, one group of bus drivers or one group of, yeah, but that's a good point you've got there, yeah. Sometimes they do that in scenarios to kind of confuse you. So I can see how that could be confusing. Always look at what are the actual people who make up the experimental group and the control group, and you'll know that that is the broader population as well. So it was hypothesized that tram drivers who had a lower amount of sleep than normal. Okay, the scenario uses the term sleep deprived. So we'll add that in as well. Sleep deprived. Okay, and then we have to write as measured by whether they had continuous sleep from a normal sleep time to 7 a.m. or whether they stayed up until 3 a.m. only having 4 hours of sleep. Okay, and then we're going to talk about what the effect of that is. So they would have a longer reaction time, or we could say a slower reaction time as measured by mean scores reaction time test. And I'm running out of space. Okay, let me just move that up. Time test compared to tram drivers. And this is our control group, tram drivers who had a normal amount of sleep. In fact, what we can do here is we can actually probably just get rid of this bit here. Okay, because we already talk about normal amount of sleep here. So that's basically our hypothesis there. We've included the population, we've included the simple IV, the simple DV, we've included how those two were measured, and we've mentioned our control group right at the end. Okay, so that's how we would write a research hypothesis for that particular question. Are there any confusions about this particular scenario? Any confusions or any kind of like doubts about how we came to a particular answer there? Oh, good. Okay, cool. We'll keep moving on. Okay, one of you asked, when is the SAC? So like I said last term, we don't have any more multiple choice short answer type SACs happening. In fact, our next SAC is more of a project. It's not really a take home project, but a project that we'll do in class. We're going to do the in-class experiment for that next week. Okay, it's going to be a bit hard because it's all online, but we're going to figure out a way for you to do an online survey so we can collect the data for our in-class experiment. Okay, it will be around the topic of social psychology. So just to give you a bit of background. So I'm pretty sure it will be interesting. Okay, we're not going to do something too dry. Okay, it's going to be something interesting. So yeah, just be ready to do that in-class experiment next week and be very critical. So at every point in the study, see what we're doing right or wrong as experimenters, see whether we're getting informed consent from you guys, because all of that will help you to write up your report. Okay, and that report or that project will essentially be your last SAC for the year. And that's usually pretty easy, I think, from experience. Most students find that to be easier than the usual SACs. Although it feels like it takes forever, it's quite straightforward.
Are you back at school?
I am back at school, and I have got your chapter 6 SACs. I've marked the multiple choice. Okay, quite a few of you have got full marks on multiple choice. I will have to take that home tonight and finish marking off the short answers. So I'll give you guys your results most likely by Monday. Okay, I don't know how I'm going to send you your papers, but I'll give you your actual marks and some feedback there. Okay.
All right, thank you.
No worries. So I will give that to you on Monday. Okay, so let's do one more just before we end for today. I'm not going to do all 6 because I don't want to drain everybody's lives today. But we'll do one more and then maybe we'll do the other 3 next week before we do our in-class experiment. Okay, so the scenario 3 looks at this idea that a psychology teacher investigates whether he can significantly improve his students' test scores. He instructs students in one of his classes to study for a topic test using their own self-directed approaches and asks students in another class to attend a teacher-directed intensive revision program run each lunchtime during the week leading up to the test. So you can see here that essentially what the teacher is measuring for change is the student's test scores. That's something that he can measure to see if it changes over time. In terms of what variable is being manipulated, so this is going to be related to the DV. In terms of what variable is being manipulated, though, we're basically looking at the method of study, or we could say the studying strategy or the studying approach. You know, you could use many different words to describe it. Okay, and that is operationalized, or that's measured by whether the student uses a self-directed approach, okay, or whether they attend a teacher-directed intensive revision program. So whether the student essentially studies independently, privately on their own, or whether they go and attend a lecture that's being conducted by the teacher, where they don't have to do much extra work. Okay, so, and obviously there's, they have to do this in the week leading up to the test, and those eventual test scores will be what are being measured for change after the students implement those respective study methods. So IV, okay, and again, you could have many different words for this. I'll write down all the possible words you could use: study methods, study strategies, study approaches to study. What else could we say? Study, you could even say study skills. Okay, either of those are all general and they all relate to what these things are, or what the IB is in general. If we're operationalizing it, that's the easy bit, because that's the bit we get mostly from our scenario. So we can say study methods. Well, I'll use the word approaches because the scenario uses that as well, as measured by whether students study in a self-directed way or whether they attend a teacher-directed revision program. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. So that's the operationalized IB. So you can see how that gives us a lot more detail. Okay, remember there are millions of study approaches out there, doing concept maps, doing Kahoots, working in groups. But when we look at the operationalized IB, it tells us that forget about all the millions of other study approaches out there. These are the two study approaches we're focusing on in this particular experiment. Okay, that's what the operationalizing part is about. If we look at the DV now, we said the DV is what we're measuring for change, okay? Simply put, we can say that the DV is the student's academic performance, okay? Or we can even say the